Welcome to The Wave. We are Voices of Ecology, a movement powered by the European Union Erasmus Plus program. WAVE brings youth voices to the forefront, from real-life interviews with youth in the eco-village movement to exploring degrowth and youth perspectives on intergenerational fairness. We're a multi-host podcast where each episode is unique and is hosted by a different WAVE participant. With a rotating format, a diversity of voices, perspectives, and passions, WAVE brings them all to the mic. Join us as we dive into bold conversations, share inspiring stories, and explore how we can all live more sustainably.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. My name is Maria Silvia, and I'm one of the WAVE ambassadors from Belgium. It is my pleasure to host this episode. Today, we will dive into a fascinating discussion about the degrowth movement. What is it and what is not? What kind of society does the degrowth movement envision? What are common myths associated with the degrowth movement? And finally, why is it gaining traction among economists, environmentalists, and policymakers? These are some of the key questions that we will address in this first episode, which will hopefully help to debunk common myths associated with the principles behind the degrowth movement. I'm thrilled to be joined by a very special guest, Professor Maïka De Keyzer. She's the head of medieval history research group at KU Leuven in Belgium. And through her research, Maika is committed to understanding how different economic systems affect historical welfare levels. She's a co-author of several academic publications, and she's an editorial board member of two journals, the BMGN Low Countries Historical Review and Journals for the History of Environment and Society. Hello, Maika. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us today. It is great to have you here. So, whether you're curious to learn more about degrowth or this is your first time encountering the term, we've got you covered. In this first episode, we'll break down the key principles of degrowth. And I hope you're ready to debunk some myths along the way. So, let's get started. So, first thing first, let's start with an icebreaker question. Could you please introduce yourself and share a bit about your background? And I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about your first encounter with the degrowth movement.
Well, hello, and thank you for the invitation, because I think this is a very fascinating topic. And yeah, I might not be the most obvious person to ask because I'm an historian and I'm a pre-modern historian. I look at societies from the Middle Ages till the early modern period, but not today's society. So it might not be that obvious then to talk about such a modern concept, to look at degrowth and economic systems of growth. It's usually not perceived as something that historians would talk about. But I am very interested in what makes societies vulnerable or resilient towards shocks, towards crises, but also what makes societies prosperous. And one of the things that always pops up is that, especially in economics and economic history, that they always assume that only with the arrival of modern economic growth, people got a more prosperous and comfortable life. It's the hockey stick curve. People were destitute and poor for pretty much the entire course of history. And with the arrival of modern economic growth, we suddenly saw the light and we suddenly got prosperity. Now, of course, that is kind of an anachronistic way of looking at it, because a lot of the time they perceive that because there is no electricity, because there is no modern science, people were poor, because if you compare them to today, they didn't have a lot of the things that we have today, which is true. But I don't think you could count the Habsburg monarchs or the Burgundian dukes, which were really, really rich at that time, because they didn't have electricity or because they didn't have modern comfort that we have, that we could perceive them as destitute or poor. So for me, that triggered the question, like, is modern economic growth required to have a prosperous life? What is prosperity? What can we perceive as a prosperous life? And is it always so that regions that experience economic growth, modern or pre-modern economic growth, are more prosperous than regions that do not do that? And that's when I started to read up with some of the literature of modern economics, like Prosperity Without Growth or the Donut Economy and books like that, that triggered me a little bit to think about this. Can we not think about types of societies that actually also prospered, even though they did not have what we see today as the essentials of modern economic growth?
That's a super nice perspective, and we're really delighted to have you here and to explore the concept also with your unique perspective, I would say. So let's dive a little bit into the core of this podcast. I'll start with a really straightforward question to set the stage. So could you please explain what degrowth means in simple terms, more broadly in terms of definitions and based on your academic profile as well?
I perceive degrowth not as actually stepping away from growth. I think the name actually doesn't do it service, because a lot of people think we just move away from our growth economy, we just eliminate growth. For me, degrowth is a type of society, a model, an idea, a blueprint for a society that does not aspire to constantly grow, to constantly have productivity grow, accumulation of capital, accumulation of goods, of commodities. But it's more than just saying, I don't want all these commodities. It's a complete reshuffle of the type of society that we want. It's a society that steps away from the idea that everybody needs to work for a wage or needs to work to make profit as a self-employed person. It's stepping away from the idea that we always have to have productivity rises and produce more. It's stepping away from the idea that everything needs to be private property, private capital, and that we invest more in other stuff. Caring for people, looking more at creating a comfortable life, creating the basic necessities for people in a different framework from a market economy where land, labor, and capital, the three big chunks of what an economy is, are allocated through the market. And so, yes, it's taking away the growth aspect, but it's actually more than that. It's just restyling how we think a society should be organized, at least ideally, in the hypothetical way of looking at a degrowth society. It's a fundamental shift away from the type of capitalist market economy that we have today and change pretty much all of those fundamental blocks, including not aspiring that type of constant growth and accumulation.
Okay, so I want to make sure that this podcast could help as much as possible our listeners to also navigate misinformation about this topic. So, and also understanding the complexity indeed of this model that encompasses a new vision of society for the future. So, how is the growth being discussed in academic circles, but also maybe understanding the gap also with what is the role of the European Commission around, and the European Union in general is playing in this conversation around degrowth?
I think the debate about degrowth currently is extremely poor. It's often an extremely polarized debate. It's a debate where pretty much both the people that are in favor and both the ones that are against it create huge cliches. So the people that are against consider it a recession. You just keep our economy as it is, our society as it is, and you take away growth, which is a recession. And then indeed people will get poorer. They will lose a lot of the things that they have today. And even quite recently, I had a discussion with an academic here at the university in Leuven, and he basically said that. And I see that in a lot of political debates and academic debates, that it's basically, shooting ourselves in the head and losing everything that we have. Also, for example, now the politicians in the Netherlands, the Liberal Party there, said that the European Union and a lot of European politicians are completely obsessed by throwing away all of our innovation, our technology, our growth, and going back basically to the Middle Ages, living almost in caves and selling off pretty much everything that we had as prosperity and innovation, which is of course an absolute cliche. But the other way around pretty much just the same thing. People that are in favor of degrowth sell an almost utopia, that we will have a perfect society with an almost ideal society with much less inequality, with people that will live harmlessly together. We will have a much more environmental friendly economy, and so on and so on. We will redistribute all of the capital, and we will redistribute all of the, for example, the machines and the industry that we have. We will have a kind of common denominator of all of those capital goods, which sounds good, but is also a little bit of an ideal of a society, and not something that I think will ever work in real life, because we're humans, and that's not how we treat each other. That's not how we work. So both are talking about either cliches or theoretical models of what a society should look like. It's, by the way, the same for growth economists. They work with models. They work with the laws of demand and supply, which do not work like they do in an economic history textbook either. And I think that we should step away from that. I think that also policymakers, people, scholars should step away and study what actually would happen. And that's what I tried to do as an historian, because the thing that I described a couple of minutes ago with what a degrowth society could be, for me, in the past, there were societies that were not exactly what people now describe in a degrowth society, but came pretty close. Before you had the dominant model of capitalist societies, market economies, you had a lot of societies that had a lot of common property rather than private property, where a lot of people did not work for a wage, but actually were self-employed or were in a care kind of industry, where they produced their own food, where it was much more environmental friendly, etc., etc., etc. But you also already had societies that were market economies. We can trace market economies back at least to the Middle Ages. And the good thing is they coexisted together. And then you can test a couple of things, that they are in the same kind of political structure, in the same time frame, in the same kind of juridical sphere, but they took different social and economic choices. And then you can see what are the results of that, prosperity-wise, welfare-wise, but also technology or innovation or something like that. And that's, I think, an approach. Now, of course, now I'm talking about my own research, and of course I think that's fine. I think it's interesting. But I think more and more people should step away from just researching an ideal to, from their perspective, as political scientists, economists, anthropologists, exact scientists, to see, okay, if we change that and that and that parameter, what would then be the result, rather than just debating theoretic models or cliches. That's, I think, what we should do.
That's a super interesting perspective indeed, also learning from the past. So from your research, more like as an historian, your profile. So indeed, so we have this two opposite vision, cliche, theoretical model on the other side. And the idea would be to step away from this approach and finding something that could be more concrete, I would say. So also by learning from the past. So I'm curious to learn. So there are these two opposite visions. Why do you think it's degrowth gaining attention among different stakeholders, where economists, environmentalists, and policymakers? Why now? Why there is this public debate now?
Well, I think we are confronted with a lot of crisis. Well, every type of society is confronted with a type of crisis, of course, but we are confronted with climate change. We're confronted with a biodiversity crisis. We're facing huge levels of inequality, much higher than in the middle of the 20th century, for example. We are confronted with populism and anti-movements, etc., etc. And well, like you had Keynes in the 20th century, and then neoliberalism, all of these models have been strategies to tackle with their problems at that particular time. But I think that a lot of people have gone disenchanted or disappointed with these strategies in the past. So either big government or killing pretty much all of the government structures and letting it go to the market, have disillusioned people, that they say, this is not working. All of these crises are getting worse, or new crises are popping up. And none of the models that we had until now in our political and economic portfolio are solving it. So they're now looking at new things, or looking at the past, or looking at, for example, commons. I see commons popping up pretty much everywhere, which is a thing that was basically eradicated by enlightened thinkers and people like Napoleon, who pretty much cut it out of all situations. Now people are thinking, hey, were these commons not good ideas? Was that not actually a better way of treating resources in a communal way than now in the hyper individualized and privatized way? So I think it's just a search for a new social, political, economic model after the two big ones that we tried in the 20th century don't seem to fit the 21st century and the problems that we're facing today.
Okay, that's really, really clear, setting the stage on this, how degrowth is gaining attention in the public debate. Maybe let's tackle this last section of this podcast, that we will go more straightforward on common myths that we have, that are present in public debate. You already touched upon some of them during in your answers as well in this conversation. But let's go straightforward on the questions to reassure our audience and our listeners. So, or at least provide a clear answers on this aspect. So, first myth. Is degrowth just another word for recession? We hear that a lot in the public debate. I think we need to repeat it, or to make it clear for our listeners as well.
Yeah, no, it's not a recession, because a recession is something that you get in a growth economy that does not reach growth. Mm-hmm. It's a failing growth economy. If you step away from the idea that you want to be a growth economy, then it's not a recession. You just organize your society differently, where growth is not the goal that you aspire to. And in that way, no, it's not a recession. It's also not just a sympathetic way of framing a recession. It is a fundamental reshuffle of the way we organize society. It's a different blueprint. Recession is something what a growth or a market economy gets when they just fail. Mm-hmm. And that's something entirely different. So that cliche, I really fundamentally hope that we can get rid of that.
I understand. Thank you so much. So, as we come to the end of our podcast, I want to thank you once again, Maika, for joining us today. Our conversation was truly inspiring and we gained so much valuable insight, so really thank you. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed this first part of our degrowth discussion. If you're curious to learn more about the degrowth movement, how it challenges the logic of continued GDP growth, and how this type of model can support the development of policies rooted in climate justice, be sure to catch our next episode. We will delve deeper into these topics and debunk another common myth about degrowth along the way, with Maika joining us once again. So please feel free to share this episode if you found it useful and interesting, and we'll see each other in the next one. Bye!
Thank you for listening to the WAVE podcast. We are Voices of Ecology. If you're inspired to act, share and learn, connect with us, then follow us on Instagram at WaveProjectEU and share the episode with another person today. Every bit keeps the wave moving forward.